Hi everyone, thanks for making the left turn. For today, Saturday, March 4th, 2017, I'm George Farrar. Welcome back to the Jack's Left channel. Welcome back to History Jacksonville. I am having a great time at the Mandarin Historical Museum, right off Mandarin Road at the Walter Jones Historical Park. And I'm going to talk with you today about Mandarin. Mandarin has a special place in my heart. I grew up in Mandarin. I lived in Mandarin in a house on Dimsdale Road, not far from Burnett Park, from the summer of 1983 until the family began splitting in 1988, and ultimately I moved to the west side in the spring of 1989 with my father. But let's talk about the distant history of Mandarin. I am going to show you some amazing pictures and film of Mandarin, the historical park. Today, here in Walter Jones Historical Park, the first historical park here in the city of Jacksonville. I'm going to, I'll present you some film and pictures of what we see today, and then we're going to go back into history. We're going to go back into the 1830s, and my goal on this episode of History Jacksonville is to tell the story of Mandarin, the Mandarin of the 19th century. Now, in the next season of History Jacksonville, I will talk at greater length about Mandarin in the 1980s. Before we get started on all these pictures I have and film from today, it's kind of interesting actually when you think about it. In the 19th century, photography was somewhat new. Film was going to be on the horizon, and the Mandarin we know of today, of course, did not exist. Now, while we're in the present, let's take a look at the Buckman Bridge. You know, the Buckman Bridge isn't all just looking at the brake lights in front of you in work traffic. At one point, the bridge was even more narrow than it is today. And, of course, before May 1st, 1970, you couldn't cross the river, the St. Johns River,
Queen Orange Park in Mandarin,
by car. You would have to use a boat. There were steamboats, there were rowboats, all sorts of boats. And at one point, Mandarin was a destination for commerce and agriculture, and, more importantly back then, the mail. Who was Walter Jones? Walter Jones owned a general store in Mandarin, and he ran a post office, and his family lived right around here. So let's just take a moment to savor a relaxing view of our Buckman Bridge, otherwise known as Interstate 295. And let's reflect on Mandarin as a destination rather than more of a crossing point. There are so many stories about Mandarin in the 19th century, and remember that Jacksonville was founded in 1822. And we, of course, had the Civil War. We'll talk about the Maple Leaf. I'll talk with you about Harriet Beecher Stowe and her coming to this area in the late 1860s and the tremendous impact she had, and the impact of people who lived and worked in an incredibly difficult environment. Remember, folks, no cars, no central AC, no Facebook, no YouTube, no television, no radio. If you could get newspapers, you were probably having a great day. We have developed so much in the city of Jacksonville, and it is my continuing mission on History Jacksonville and throughout the Left Turn Network at theleftturnetwork.com to continue to bring these things in a nonprofit, collective format for you. And I think that this great camera that I have, the Canon Vixia 800, is doing some great work today. We are truly reaching the next level on History Jacksonville. So now I present to you History Jacksonville, our Mandarin. Let's roll it. As I begin, I'd like to express a special thanks to the great folks at the Mandarin Museum. I had an opportunity to tour the schoolhouse, which I'll talk about with you later. And so, a unique museum, some great exhibits. Definitely check it out if you're in the Mandarin area. Now, I'm going to take you back as we look at the beautiful Mother Nature in the historic park today. I am going to talk with you about the 1830s, and we'll move forward in time, going up to around 1900. Now, in the 1830s, Florida was not yet a state of the United States. Florida was a territory. And I'm going to be speaking to you today with some information that I've obtained not only at the museum and elsewhere, but from a fascinating book entitled Mandarin on the St. John's by Mary Graff, a 1953 book. I'm looking at the 1998 edition. And it's important to remember that in the 1830s, there were still Native Americans. There were conflicts between the Native Americans and the settlers. Now we're looking at a farmhouse that was constructed later on in the 19th century. I would like to now kind of address a common theme that you'll encounter in this history of Mandarin. And I'm going to quote briefly on page 16 from the book. The coldest day on record in Mandarin was Sunday, February 8, 1835, when the thermometer registered 7 degrees above zero. On this morning, the villagers awoke to a strange sight. Water, frozen along the river, several rods from the shore. According to the historian T. Frederick Davis, the natives advanced the theory that a large iceberg drifted down from the north, was stranded on the Florida coast, and gave the territory of Florida the coldest weather in the memory of the oldest inhabitant. Fruit trees of every description were destroyed down to the roots, and even some of the forest trees were killed by this sudden cold. The wild orange groves suffered equally with the cultivated groves. The natives viewed the strange spectacle with mixed emotions. Some were fascinated by this new wonder. Others were depressed by the loss of their livelihood. Thereafter, whenever the discussion centered on the weather, all comparisons were computed by the cold Sunday of 1835. Now we're looking at a reconstructed barn that was built in 1876, is reconstructed in 1999. In 1841, the territorial legislature passed a law to incorporate Mandarin. And from page 23 of Mandarin on the St. John's, I'll read a brief portion of that legislation. It said that all free white male inhabitants over the age of 21 years, comprehended between Budge Creek and Horse Landing on the east side of the River St. John, and extending 1 mile back from the said river, should be incorporated as the town of Mandarin. Later on, the town would be disbanded, but 1841 was a critical year, because in 1841, there was an attack by the Native Americans upon the home of William Hartley, and I'll read briefly from page 24. After nightfall, the Indians approached the home of William Hartley, where his wife, with an infant in her arms, and William Malthus and Domingo Acosta were sitting by the fire. The Indians fired into the open door and killed Miss Hartley and Mr. Acosta. Though severely wounded, Mr. Malthus ran into the thicket, where he was found dead the following morning. The Indians then proceeded to the home of Nathaniel Hartley. Having been alarmed by the earlier shots, the family escaped, not 30 yards in advance of the raid. The house was plundered and burned, as was the adjoining home of George Hartley. The Hartleys, providently, escaped. Ultimately, in time, the conflict between the Native Americans and the early settlers of Mandarin ceased, and a couple years later, in 1845, Florida became a state. Now, there was a lot of development that was happening. A lot of steamboats were starting to go up and down the river, the railroads were getting started, but there was a setback. And that setback for everyone in the United States of America was Civil War. And in the early hours, the early morning hours of April 1st, 1864, the Civil War came to this area in the form of a torpedo, an early mine, an early torpedo that hit a steamboat called the Maple Leaf. 4 people were killed. The survivors had to row themselves back in lifeboats back to what we know as downtown Jacksonville. So this was quite a thrilling time to be alive if you managed, I guess, to survive. And as the Civil War ended, growth and development were on the horizon through river transportation and through the redevelopment of the fruit industry. And Mandarin had quite a role in that. Hotels downtown Jacksonville in the 1860s were just being constructed. The railroad and these hotels were beginning to attract tourists from the north, people who lived what we call up north. They wanted to come down and experience at the time, the exoticness of Florida. And the way to get around, if not by railroad, was by steamboat. And it was the river that brought Harriet Beecher Stowe here. Now, first, I'd like to talk with you about a schoolhouse that very recently was moved, an old schoolhouse that was moved to the Walter Jones Historical Park. And I, as I mentioned earlier, had the opportunity to go inside. And quite an experience. In the late 1860s, early 1870s, there were these French nuns that came over, and they were teaching on the eastern seaboard, Savannah, St. Augustine, and they began to teach here in Mandarin. And there was a nun, Sister Julie Roselle, who thought highly of the students she was teaching in Mandarin. Now, these were white students, African American students, and this was right after the Civil War, and this was during what's called the Reconstruction period. Now, back then, there was an effort to improve the lives of recently freed slaves and their families. And these nuns attended to this effort. And people would look back fondly later on at this effort. Now, as we start to step out of the schoolhouse, we'll take one quick last look at the schoolhouse. Notice the well, the water well. Again, I keep coming back to the fact that this was a very rural area, okay? The roads that we know of did not exist at this time. City services that we know of did not exist at this time. So this was the environment in which white people and African Americans were learning together, working together. And you see an example of some of the books generally from the time. And so this, though, was somewhat controversial what was going on because there were the racial dynamics that would later on change things. And so this was a unique time in American history. And along comes Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist. She, among many people, particularly, of course, in the North, were opposed to slavery. And at the end of the Civil War, people came to the South. Some people came to the South for business reasons, some came for political reasons, some came for a new start. Remember, Florida was still a frontier. And there's an apocryphal story that one time President Abraham Lincoln, before he died, during the Civil War had met with author Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he said something along the lines of, "You're the little lady who started this big war." So if you think about it, all these different things happening. The Civil War is over. Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. We're in the 1860s. Harriet Beecher Stowe has decided to purchase land in Mandarin and has decided to set up an orange and other fruits, a grove of oranges and other fruits to make some money to sell. And that was the big thing. That was how people made money farming. And so she also, though, in the 1870s wrote a book called Palmetto Leaves. She really loved Florida. And I'll read to you from that. The fact is that people cannot come to heartily like Florida till they accept certain deficiencies as a necessary shadow to certain excellences. If you want to live in an orange orchard, you must give up wanting to live surrounded by green grass. When we get to the new heaven and the new earth, then we shall have it all right. There we shall have a climate at once cool and bracing, yet hot enough to mature oranges and pineapples. Our trees of life shall bear 12 manner of fruit, and yield a new one every month. Out of juicy meadows, green as emerald, enameled with every kind of flower, shall grow our golden orange trees, blossoming and fruiting together as now they do. There shall be no mosquitoes or gnats or black flies or snakes, and best of all, there shall be no fretful people. Everybody shall be like a well-tuned instrument, all sounding in accord, and never a semitone out of the way. Meanwhile, we caution everybody coming to Florida, don't hope for too much, because you hear that roses and callas blossom in the open air all winter, and flowers abound in the woods. Don't expect to find an eternal summer. Prepare yourself to see a great deal that looks rough and desolate and coarse. Prepare yourself for some chilly days and nights, and whatever else you neglect to bring with you, bring the resolution strong and solid, always to make the best of things. She was a tremendous force in the community. She had her home that she would winter in. She, from what I hear, spent 15 winters in Mandarin. And she very much was a big booster of tourism in Florida, okay? I mean, before Disney, before the railroads even extended down to South Florida, she was a big booster. And people would hop on these steamboats, having read her writings and seen all these different things appearing in the newspaper and literature, wanting to go to this exotic place. They would pay something like 75 cents of 1860s, 1870s money to see her. They had these kind of people that would come off the steamboats, and they would kind of give a little tour of the area. In the 1870s, she was invited to Tallahassee, to our old state capital, or what we would now call the old state capital, to be recognized by the 11th governor of Florida, Marcellus Stearns, for her efforts to attract people to visit Florida, and also for her efforts to educate the newly freed slaves and their families, the students, and her efforts to do things in Mandarin and to make Florida a better place. Now, later on, she left Florida after there were some, her orange groves experienced a devastating freeze. She left Florida, not to return. This happened in 1883, 1884, in that time frame. So Mandarin would continue on, but these freezes that were happening were impacting the industry of the area. Now, in 1895, a gentleman named Lasco, he was his name was Frank Ruiz Lasco, and he was an Italian immigrant, and he had a winery, and he would put together something like 40 barrels of wine a year, and you see the winery relocated here to the historical park. So Mandarin would continue on, and we have a lot to thank for the people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who during the Reconstruction period were doing the best that they could to provide education for all, which would ultimately help agriculture and industry in our area. Now, we all, of course, know the Bourbon Restoration and the changes that would come later on with Jim Crow laws and things like that. Now, here you have a picture of the old Mandarin Post Office General Store. And so I want to thank you for joining me today. This, I think, is one of the best opportunities I've had to speak with you about history here in Jacksonville. And the best is yet to come. I've got a lot ahead for you. We've got coming up on History Jacksonville, our Main Street Bridge, 103rd Street, Part 2, We Hit the Road, and our Rediscovered Town. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. See you later.